Our next speaker is one of my favorite people. He was one of the first people I ever talked to when I got this whole crazy project started, and is a real inspiration for me in the way that he opened the 10th Amendment just out of his apartment, and I started this from a basement. So Michael Boldin is the founder and president of the 10th Amendment Center, which focuses on education about the 10th Amendment and its role in the nullification of federal laws. That's a lot of laws to repeal. So, without further ado, Michael Boldin.
I did not promise him any of that shit, so. We don't need no stinking permission. Am I right? Because it ain't liberty if it comes with a government permission slip. We don't need no stinking permission to exercise our rights. We need to learn how to exercise our rights whether the government people want us to or not. Cool, thanks anyone. Any questions? All right, I guess we got to get into a little boring stuff here. I don't know about the nuts and bolts, but we can do that in Q&A, I guess, if I don't go too long. We have a few ANCAPs here, right? I know I've seen a few Rothbard shirts, right? Oh, the whole fucking place. Everybody's an ANCAP. They just don't know it yet, right? So let's start this party out with a little Lysander Spooner. Not really an ANCAP, but I know a lot of you guys love him. I do. Here's how Spooner put it. To say that an unconstitutional law must be obeyed until it is repealed is saying that an unconstitutional law is just as obligatory as a constitutional one. I know everyone knows one quote by Spooner, usually out of context, not this one, unfortunately. That's from his great 1850 pamphlet, A Defense for Fugitive Slaves. It's one of my favorites. Also, Trial by Jury, 1852 is another good one. But here he was arguing against the constitutionality of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and the more recent one, Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And he urged or argued, made the case for, and strategically advised resistance and nullification on a state, local, and individual level in response. That's Spooner. Here's what else he said. An unconstitutional statute is no law in the view of the Constitution. It is void. Remember the word void. We're going to hear that every word out of my mouth is going to be void. It is void and confers no authority on anyone. Now, Spooner wasn't making anything up. He was a pretty smart guy. He was a very, if not controversial, he was a very highly recognized legal scholar on the Constitution. Surprise, surprise. But what he was doing here, saying that an act against the Constitution was void, sorry, tag me on that. What he was saying, he was actually reiterating exactly what the big government Federalist people were saying during the ratification debates over the Constitution. He was literally just saying, this is what they said. He didn't use those words, but he was repeating what the people of the several states, the ratifiers, understood the Constitution to mean, the limits, that an act outside of it is void. Here's a few examples. Oliver Ellsworth, anyone know the name? No, okay. Oh, one, nice. You listen to my podcast. One person, that's amazing. It is Path to Liberty at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Path to Liberty. Use coupon code WOODS for 10% off. Where is Woods and Mrs. Woods? Future Mrs. Woods. Okay, we'll hang out with them later. So Oliver Ellsworth was the third Chief Justice of the United States. He was nominated by George Washington. He was, at the time, a pretty big government guy in comparison to some of the others. Here's how he put it. Remember what Spooner said. If they make a law which the Constitution does not authorize, it is void. Almost the same phrase. Roger Sherman, this is the only guy who signed only person in history who signed all four of the Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution, said almost the same thing in a December 8th, 1787 letter. He said, all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. Kind of a pattern, right? How about the piece of shit Alexander Hamilton, right? You know they shot him. Snitches get stitches. Sorry. I had a red-eye flight last night from LA, and back in my country, it's a little weird. Here's Alexander Hamilton in his own Hamilton kind of way. Federalist number 78. Sounds a little like Spooner. There is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of a delegated authority, contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void. Spooner, Hamilton, couldn't be more opposite, right? But it's kind of a pattern. Spooner didn't come up with it. Hamilton didn't come up with it. We could probably trace it back. Now, I haven't gone further than this. Back to James Otis Jr., 1761. His arguments against the writs of assistance. James Adams repeatedly referred to this particular long-ass speech as the beginning of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain. And here's how James Otis put it. An act against the Constitution is void. Okay, this is going to get boring, right? But really what this is, and it's important to point out that this was, at the time in 1761, this was a monumental shift in the understanding of sovereignty in American political thought. Sovereignty we can understand as final authority, right? I guess right. All through history, government has held final authority. Government has rules. Government says, well, we changed those rules, so we're going to apply those rules the way we want to. That's sovereignty for the founders, the old revolutionaries. This was always, they knew it was in the hands of a single person, like a king or a queen, a small cabal of people, maybe a parliament, a congress, some judges. I would say really sovereignty today, people have basically turned that over to the Supreme Court, some people in dresses, as Di Lorenzo would put it. So here Otis was basically saying that no longer is government sovereign. Because if government violates, and he was talking about the Constitution in 1761, this was an unwritten British Constitution, it's not something that was decades later. But he's saying, like, look, if government violates the rules that are given to them, it doesn't count. And when John Adams talked about the revolution, he was very clear over and over and over in letters throughout the years. He would say that the war wasn't the revolution. The revolution, he said, commenced years before the war happened. It was a radical change in the viewpoints, the opinions, the sentiments of the people. That's what he called the real American Revolution. A revolution really is a revolution in thought. And sometimes there's a war after it. Not that I want that kind of stuff, but... So this change in understanding of sovereignty was a big part of that real American Revolution. And Otis was recognizing that something outside of government was supreme. For the founding generation, they were basically saying the laws that the people delegated in the Constitution, that was supreme. And if government didn't follow that, then there was a problem, right? Here's how Thomas Jefferson put it in the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. We're all familiar, yes? Ish? We've heard it. You guys all listen to Tom's podcast. You've heard this at least once. Whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, Jefferson wrote, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Now, for those of you still thinking about Spooner like I am, it should be pretty effing obvious. Sorry, I noticed there's some family here. It should be pretty obvious that waving a document at the largest government in the history of the planet isn't going to do shit to stop these people. And we shouldn't be surprised. Ever. Because here's the deal. Words on paper don't enforce themselves, and they never, ever, ever, ever will. And we shouldn't expect them to either. John Dickinson, anyone know the name? No, a few. This guy was known as the penman of the Revolution. He wrote the most widely read documents on American liberty up until Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January 1776. We call James Madison the father of the Constitution. Dickinson was the father of the Articles of Confederation. He was the first drafter of the Articles. Here's how he put it when he was arguing for ratification of the Constitution. A good Constitution promotes, but not always produces, a good administration. So what Dickinson was recognizing was that it doesn't matter what words you have. I mean, obviously, you don't want to tell the government, well, yeah, you can force people to take this medicine, for example. You don't want to just outright give them the power. But it doesn't matter how good it is, because you always need something else other than the document to keep government in check. You need something more than words on paper. Madison, father of the Constitution, in Federalist 48, arguing for ratification of the document. We all think he was the main guy writing. He wasn't really the dude, but he was pretty influential. He referred to the document as a mere parchment barrier. Parchment barriers don't do shit. I mean, really. I'm the Constitution guy telling you guys this. Here's how Madison put it. This is a long quote, but I'll break it up because it's important. Madison says, Federalist 48, will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments in the Constitution of the government, and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power? He's asking an important question. Should we make this an amazing document and then trust it to keep the government in check? He recognized, that old maxim, power corrupts absolutely, right? But it's more than just the corruption. Power always grows. It doesn't matter how little or how much power you give people, once they have it, they want more. Ring of power, we know the analogy there, right? Abigail Adams, she says, power, whether vested in few or many, is ever grasping. Samuel Adams, power is intoxicating. I wonder if that was a pun. He literally said that. Power is intoxicating, and men legally vested with it, and I'm butchering this paraphrase, legally vested with it will always seek to expand it. Samuel Adams. George Mason. We got anyone here from GMU? Cool. George Mason once warned, I fear the thirst of power will prevail to oppress the people. They all recognize that once you give someone power, they will always seek to expand it. Back to Madison, he's talking about how, should we limit the government with the document? Of course, he was on board with that, but he knew you had to do more than that. He said, this is the security which appears to have been principally relied upon by the compilers of most American constitutions, the state ones, Pennsylvania, elsewhere. But experience assures us, he's pretty certain about this, that the efficacy of the provision has been greatly overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary. That's the Constitution guy telling you that. The Constitution guy telling people to ratify the Constitution says, okay, we got some good shit here, but we need something more, something indispensably necessary. And he continued telling us a little more. The conclusion I am warranted in drawing from these observations is a mere demarcation on parchment is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hands. Relying on the government to limit the government is dumb. Honestly, that means voting the bums out just gets you more bums. Suing in court and asking government courts to limit government power done by government politicians who appointed them to the government courts doesn't work. We live under the largest empire in history. So that's all the proof we need. So there is something else that's needed. What is that? John Hancock. This has got to be late January 1788 in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. Massachusetts, under Hancock, Adams, and some others, basically were influential. The Constitution was going to be killed until Massachusetts, basically. It was not going to be ratified. They were losing. They were doing vote counts in January. They did them back then, too. Massachusetts was voting against. A deal was made between Federalists. Do you guys care about this stuff? This is totally side note. Newman will talk about this, who I need to meet. This guy's amazing over here. I'm a fan. So anyway, so they were going to vote it down. They were doing vote counts, and they came up with a deal. Theophilus Parsons, who was kind of like the Patrick Henry of Massachusetts, a really strong orator, but he was the other side of the spectrum. He was a Federalist, supporter of the Constitution. Parsons, along with, this pastor, Samuel West, I think. I forget his name. But they convinced Hancock, Samuel Adams, and a few others to say, okay, go for ratification as long as we can propose some amendments. And the first thing that they recommended for amendments, saying we're going to ratify under these basically kind of conditions. It wasn't technically conditional under the law or under the ratification process, but they're saying if you guys don't do this, we're going to have a problem. And the first thing they recommend is what became the 10th Amendment. That is the powers that they don't have, everything else is reserved. So what did Hancock say? He's like, okay, finally I'm going to speak, and I'm going to urge ratification. And he says, the powers reserved by the people render them secure. He didn't say the ability to choose new representatives or a new president renders them secure. He didn't say the ability to sue them in their courts renders them secure. The power is reserved to the people. So he was really acknowledging two important things, two important principles. One, sovereignty. Final authority rests with the people, not with the government. And two, the real checks and balances are not the balances between the three branches of the same entity. It's really the states and the people. And that quote that I had from Roger Sherman earlier, all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. He actually had a follow-up on that. He said, nor could they be enforced against the sense of the majority of the states. He knew that if the federal or the general government at the time, we can call it the central state today, if they tried to enforce something and people didn't want it, it's not like the federal government would be like, oh, well, Massachusetts, they're not on board. We're over it. Okay, no problem. No, tyrants are going to do what they do. They're going to keep trying to enforce it, and there may be some kind of a standoff between the states and the central government. That's how you keep the government in check. And what Sherman was doing was really, we've basically absorbed Sherman's view at 10th Amendment Center as our strategy. It's two main points. One, acts outside of the Constitution are void from the moment they're enacted. Two, while void in principle, it needs something else to render them void in practice and effect. This sounds like Spooner, who I'll get back to in a moment. But I want to first point out that this idea of conflict between a far-off government and maybe a local one or individuals, this is a long part of the American tradition. People like James Otis, for example, he repeatedly decried what they called the doctrine of passive obedience and non-resistance. Whoever would palm that view on his people is a traitor to his country. Non-resistance, meaning when they do shit they're not supposed to do, you're supposed to resist, not beg. John Dickinson, back to that guy. In response to the Stamp Act, he published a broadside, November 1765, where he was urging the people to do something. And here's how he put it. If you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. So to the penman of the Revolution, the father of the Articles of the Confederation, that's my own name for him, it's not real, but he was like the first drafter of it. To him, compliance means slavery. Why? He said, you voluntarily establish the detestable precedent which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. We talk about precedent when we talk about government. We don't want them to have precedent to do new stuff. So if there's an executive order that, mandates a health policy out of stuff, like legislating from the executive branch, legislating from the judicial branch, that establishes precedent for them to build upon, and then power always grows. But that precedent doesn't go anywhere without compliance. So they can pass whatever they want, but if enough people refuse to participate, it's just words on paper. John Hancock summed up that same kind of spirit of resistance in a letter to his London agent, I think it was Jonathan Bernard. Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, little tip of the hat to Newman over here, has a great history of this people's nullification of the Stamp Act. You have to read it if you like Rothbard and you're interested in history. But Hancock wrote Jonathan Bernard, and he said, the people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. And they got rid of it by refusing to participate, refusing to comply. And this is what Spooner said in 1850. Spooner was a man. The right of the people, Spooner wrote, to resist an unconstitutional law is absolute and unqualified from the moment the law is enacted. Remember, resist the moment the law is enacted. Compare that to Thomas Jefferson in maybe his second draft for the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. He put it this way: in cases of an abuse of the delegated powers, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be the constitutional remedy. I'll break that down in a second. But wait, there's more. He continued, he said, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Not a good idea, not something to think about, not something to do after waiting 2 or 4 or 6 years for some new bums or new court cases or new protests, but the rightful remedy. Or as Spooner put it, 52 years later, my math is bad, I went to government school. I don't know geography, I can't add, I can't do all kinds of stuff. They really screwed me up. Resist from the moment the law is enacted. Jefferson was far from alone, so was Spooner. Here's future Supreme Court Justice James Iredell from North Carolina in the ratification debates in 1788, put it the same way. He was also a Federalist big government guy, nominated to the Supreme Court by George Washington. He said this: the only resource against usurpation. Do we all know what usurpation means? It's an exercise of powers not delegated in the Constitution. St. George Tucker, the great legal mind of the early 19th century, I guess late 18th century too, but in 1803 he said usurpation, an act outside the Constitution, is treason against the sovereignty of the people. So treason, exercising powers they're not supposed to exercise, is treason against the final authority of the people, according to Tucker. I think it's a good one to throw in there. So he said the only resource against usurpation, this is James Iredell again, is the inherent right, natural right of the people to prevent its exercise, not to beg the government to stop. not to sue the government and hope that the government will stop the government. It's the inherent natural right of the people to stop it from being implemented. He says this is the case in all free governments in the world. That might be a little of an oxymoron, but there are a lot of ANCAPs here. These jokes do not go over well with Republicans, let me tell you that. Those fuckers don't get any of it. Anyways, Iredell says, the people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it. Again, like Jefferson, notice he didn't consider resistance something you try 2 or 4 or 6 years down the line, but as soon as they usurp power, as soon as they exercise something, or as Spooner put it, from the moment the law is enacted. James Madison, who in some ways was a little more hardcore than Jefferson, and in some ways was not. But in Federalist 46, he had a 4-step blueprint for how to stop federal programs without relying on the federal government to limit its own power, which will never, ever, 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 ever happen. He recommended things like, well, protests was part of it, getting governors to be outspoken, legislative devices in the states, and, Madison's words, not mine, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Directly refuse to cooperate with federal officers. That, according to Madison, is how you keep the federal government in check. And he said at the time, if a number of states did this in unison, it would present obstructions the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. This was at a time, even though the Constitution was creating a larger government than under the Articles, I mean, still in comparison today, they tell us how big our toilet can be, what kind of plants, what's going on with legalization here in Virginia. I don't see any stores yet. It feels kind of archaic. Okay. Okay, well, you guys are getting there. It's a long road. When you start having 30-minute delivery, just trust me, it's a whole new world. We have a company in California, in my home country, called Eaze, E-A-Z-E. Go on the app, it's like Uber for weed. A lot of Uber drivers, when they're not getting a lot of rides, especially during the pandemic, they've immediately gone to working for Eaze, but you can only do weed delivery. This is totally, I was not prepared to talk about this, but this is some personal. If anybody ever wants to come visit and do a delivery, it's pretty amazing. So a lot of people work for them. They make more money doing cannabis delivery. The first day that Newsom shut down our lives in L.A. last year, that's the first thing I did. I made my largest weed delivery order in my lifetime. Fuck you. I don't know what I'm even talking about. Where am I even talking about? Oh yeah, government's so massive today in comparison to what Madison, even the big government version that Madison was offering at the time, was tiny comparison today. When Jefferson cut the size of the military in 1801 to whenever he was done in office, I mean, we're talking hundreds of people, not millions, not people based in 80 plus locations, whatever it is, 180 military installations around the world. Absolutely tiny. And even then, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union was the way to defeat the federal government. So we didn't get that shutdown, did we? Did they end up passing something to avert a shutdown? I mean, not a real one, right? I mean, these shutdowns, they're so manipulative because, they'll keep bombing the shit out of people around the world. The spies keep spying, the gun grabbers keep grabbing, they keep throwing people in cages for having plants or for owning stuff. Or I guess eventually for not getting the right shot. Who knows what will happen, right? They keep doing that, but they'll take something where people have they've become dependent on government through things like Social Security and say, well, if you don't let us raise that ceiling, no Social Security check for grandma. I mean, this is really, really manipulative. So they don't shut stuff down, really. It's not a shutdown. But during I think it was the last one, I don't really pay much attention to Washington, D.C. Sorry, guys. I think the best thing you can do is forget the 202 area code exists unless you have family in the area. I live as far away as I humanly can in the other tyranny. But back in 2013, during that other big shutdown where they closed some parks and we were supposed to freak out about it, the National Governors Association was freaked out. I mean, literally, they were in a panic. And they sent what we could call, I guess, a circular letter, basically concerned that if you shut this down, you're going to have a real problem. And they sent a letter out to people in Congress. And what was their concern? States are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. One more time. States are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. The dirty little secret no one wants you to know is that partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. So following James Madison's advice of a refusal to cooperate with officers of the union is so much more powerful now because every single thing they try to implement requires state, local enforcement to actually come into practice. OSHA, for example. OSHA. I did a podcast on this recently, in case anyone's wondering. You still get that coupon code with Woods for the next 20 minutes. It's a callback. So I learned that OSHA has 774 inspection officers for the entire country. 774 absolutely cannot. Well, I'll step back. OSHA says they have 2,000 compliance officers for the whole country. 774 are federal employees. The rest of them are in the states. So even on OSHA, for example, the majority of enforcement is done by the states. We know, for example, that the ATF, which shouldn't exist, the only constitutional thing that the ATF should do is disband. That's it. Nothing more. Where's Maj? The ATF has about 5,100 employees for the entire country. 5,100. A third of them are in administration. That means, again, government school math, what is that, like 3,500 enforcement officers for the whole country? They close somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 gun cases per year. It's a person power issue. 8,000 to 10,000. The most ever was under Donald Trump. The second most ever was under Donald Trump. And the third most ever was under Donald Trump. Fourth was Obama, the gun grabber. Take that, NRA. That's real. That's a total side note. But they can only close between 8,000 and 10,000 cases per year. But if you think of it like this, let's say there were 10 or 11 million undocumented short-barreled shotguns out there, all in violation of the National Firearms Act of 1934. There is absolutely no way in hell they could ever enforce this, even with the support of the states and local communities. So it really is a numbers game when you're talking about a very dangerous paper tiger, but really, when it gets down to it, it is a house of cards. They cannot enforce what they want to enforce. Here's how Spooner summed it up. We can do some questions for a few minutes so I don't go too long. Spooner put it this way: the exercise of this right of resistance is neither rebellion against the Constitution nor revolution. It is a maintenance of the Constitution itself by keeping the government within the Constitution. To Spooner, if government tries to go outside the Constitution and no one obeys them, the government is just de facto within the Constitution, period. It could be applied on a state level too, because there are state constitutions too. He says, and this is where he gets very Spoonery, this is awesome. It is also a defense of the natural rights of the people against robbers and trespassers. Because, of course, in order to implement these programs, they have to rob from you. Taxation is theft hats, right? They have to steal from you to have the programs. For those people to have jobs, they're living off of stolen funds in the first place. They're trespassing your property, your lives. They're kidnapping people. They're locking them up in cages. There couldn't be anything worse. But according to Spooner, the way you keep them in check is you overwhelm them. So this is a defense of the natural rights of the people against robbers and trespassers who attempt to set up their own personal authority and power in opposition to those of the Constitution and people which they were appointed to administer. And what they're all saying, from Spooner back to Otis to Dickinson, Hancock, Jefferson, not Hamilton. Everybody but Hamilton. They're saying resistance and opposition on a state, local, and individual level should be your first response, not the last resort. It has to be the first response, because every time you comply, you establish the detestable precedent, and they will use it to do more. At the end of the day, to me, my favorite way of putting this comes from Walt Whitman's Caution, his great abolitionist poem. Anyone know Walt Whitman? Well, no. Walt Whitman's Caution, first published in 1860, Leaves of Grass. I should read it just to make sure. Whitman, he was a nullifier. He specifically said, well, first it was John Greenleaf Whittier who said, when it comes to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, I am a nullifier. And they asked Whitman about this. Whoa, this guy's talking about nullification? I thought that was just John C. Calhoun and racists. No, Walt Whitman, great abolitionist. He said the nullification referred to by Mr. Whittier is loyalty to goodness. But anyways, this is his poem that I absolutely love. To the states, or any one of them, or any city of the states, resist much, obey little. Once unquestioning obedience, once fully enslaved. Once fully enslaved, no nation, state, city of this earth ever afterward resumes its liberty. So remember this. If you don't remember any of that history shit I gave you, remember this. Resist much, obey little, peace, LPMC. I love you guys. Thank you for having me.
Q&A? All right, that was quick. We only got one mic for this one, so bear with me.
Oh, it's going to be a fireside chat.
So, concerning the movement we've seen grow over the past few years of the self-labeled conservative nationalists, a lot of their intellectuals and thought leaders are in the Straussian tradition, where they view conception of the United States as, and the revolution and our founding as the success of a unitary nation, of an activist government, and this is how they view American history going from there. I know a lot of us in this room focus a lot on the transgressions of the left, but when it comes to these new nationalists, how do you think people like us speaking in the decentralist tradition, do you think we have any common ground with these people? And what is the best way when speaking to someone, a layman, who views the United States as a unitary nation and in that tradition, what is the best way to make them conceive of it as a fundamentally decentralist republic?
Holy crap, I'm honored that you think I'm that intelligent. What the fuck did he just say? I heard something about right-wingers suck, and I'm like, hell yeah, they do. Dudes, I'm an activist. Like, there are people here who are academics, and I am not one. I did not graduate college. When the New York Times asked me, oh, so are you an attorney for drafting that legislation to turn off water to the NSA? And I said, hell no, I still have blood in my veins. Let me see if I'm grasping this very quickly. Can you make alliances with people on the right? I don't know who the hell that is. What I think is either you believe in liberty or you suck. Okay? So whatever the hell they want to call themselves, if they're good, let's say, on some kind of mandate, they probably crap on the drug war. If they're good on the drug war, they're probably crap on a mandate. If they're good on foreign policy, they're Ron Paul. Part of what I do in my work, I do two-part work. It's kind of based on Samuel Adams's, he wrote this great letter in the Boston Gazette, which was the mouthpiece for the Sons of Liberty. He said, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. So we do kind of a two-piece work, and I'm gonna, I think, answer your question. I think. If not, sorry. You have to educate people on the proper role of government, on the values of liberty, of freedom, and then you also have to teach them how to defend that. I'm doing a little of this, not the nuts and bolts that Michael promised you. He lied. But so we do about 50% of our work is activism. We build coalitions on single issues. We work with some of the hardest left commies on ending militarization of police on a local level. Stop LAPD spying coalition in my neighborhood. They are literally Marxists. They are terrible on almost everything I love and hold dear, but they are amazing on trying to end surveillance, whether it's drone surveillance or stingrays or cell site simulators or whatever. So I will work with them on that, recognize they're friends with me on that, and recognize they're enemies of me on almost everything else. I do this with someone from the right, from the left, from the new nationalist. I don't give a shit. If they're good on something and they're willing to do the work on the ground to get something positive forward for liberty, I will work with them on that, and then they make fun of me and other things. I was at a meeting at ACLU headquarters a few years ago, and I'm hanging out, and we're talking about things to stop mass surveillance on a state level. And they thought it was funny. They're like, yeah, you guys, I mean, we love you on this, but yeah, you're in all that anti-Obamacare and pro-gun stuff. I'm like, hell yeah, we are. Let's talk about surveillance. So that's my view on everything. I don't know, does that even come close to answering your question? It's fine, okay. It's fine. I love you, man. I love you. I will give you a hug for that. Any other questions?
Well, I got one right here, but I want to add to that. I'm going to bite Jeff Dice style a little bit to answer your question. I think right now, more than ever, because of the COVID regime, because people are seeing their kids masked up and all the psychological damage, and they don't know what to do with it, you're starting to see the conceptualization of what the national identity is shift. And people are starting to identify with states more than they are with the overarching idea of America. So people are flooding to Florida because they identify with what Florida, the freedom that Florida provides, at least as it pertains to the COVID regime. I think you can...
Not the drug war.
Not the drug war. But I think when right-wingers kind of have that conversation, you can inflame that because that is a decentralist impulse. Now, they're taking it from national to the state, but you can take them from there to its logical conclusion to the locality, the people, the individual.
I also think that's actually an excellent point. Like Patrick Henry referred to himself as a Virginian, right? Oh, yeah, right. I forgot where I am. Holy shit. It's amazing. I do that a lot. It's the cannabis. I have found sometimes when I work in these coalitions, they'll be like, you know, Boldin is so solid on this gun shit. He's better than the NRA has ever been. And we are a 10th Amendment center. We blow NRA away on the right to keep and bear arms because we believe it's a natural right. And if it comes with a permission slip, you're begging. Anyways, sometimes what happens, and this is a long game, sometimes they'll be like, well, that dude was so on it on something that's so important to me, I'm at least willing to hear them out on something else. Anyways. Any other questions? You in the nice jacket, sir.
Oh, thank you so much. J. Crew, I think. Let me
Very nice,
yeah.
very nice. Very
so, So much of the tyranny, the COVID tyranny that we've dealt with the past 2 years has come from the state level and not as much from the federal level.
Wrong.
Well,
all of it
okay,
is
you're right.
funded by the feds. Your state, every time they oppress you, they're almost certainly getting the cash, and they're getting away with it due to federal judicial precedent or federal funds. Do you think Gavin Newsom could have pulled off what he has done to my community? To all the independent businesses that get shut down. I want to go get a coffee. I live in coffee land. They call my neighborhood literally Coffee fucking Row. All these independent small mom and pop people, they're out of business, but Starbucks is there. No way could they have pulled that off without federal emergency funding, federal expanded unemployment. So yes, the states suck, but if we follow the loot, sorry, I cut you off totally. Please go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask if you had any practical recommendations for how local governments could resist their state governments.
No, I don't. It's actually very difficult to pull off because the relationship between a state and the federal government in law and under the Constitution is totally opposite of the relationship between a locality and a state. The states, or the people of the states, created the federal government. The localities are creatures or political subdivisions of the states. Technically in Florida, the governor, I think with a vote of the state senate, can remove a sheriff at whim, for example. It doesn't happen real often. But in the end, I think it really is Spooner. The only way to keep them in check is resistance. It's James Iredell. The only resource against usurpation is resistance. So that strategy plays out the same. But when it comes to like local legislation against the state, I think that's more of a rallying people to the cause thing. Does that help? Okay, cool. I don't want to go late here because Patrick is pretty awesome. We got 12 minutes. Awesome. Questions?
So obviously the Mises Caucus is focused often more locally.
Yes.
So we seem to have a lot of alignment with your amazing organization. What do you see as
Thank
the
you.
best actions that folks like us can take? You know, we don't always have direct legislative input to help the states that we're in resist the federal government. What can individuals do to sort of make progress towards that goal?
What is important to you? What issue is, like, what's your big issue? Are you a Federal Reserve dude? Are you a war? What? War, guns. Okay. Well, in Missouri, we've worked for 8 years, for example, to pass what has now been signed into law called the Second Amendment Preservation Act. 8 straight years we worked on this piece of legislation, and it finally got passed because the governor thought it was a good political statement against Joe Biden, but who gives a shit, right? In Missouri, law enforcement is now complaining, a lot of them, because they love the drug war, that this bill is so tight and it stops them from doing so much stuff without getting caught, like violating it, because cops will still do that anyways. But it's so difficult that they're not able to enforce gun or some drug laws even, because they're not able to partner with the federal government. So what we did was we worked on a piece of legislation in Missouri, also in Arizona, where it bans the state from using personnel, material support, or resources, which is language I lifted from the Patriot Act, but flipped it the other direction. You can't, seriously. Ban the use of material support or resources to help implement or effectuate any federal gun control measure that's not currently on the books in the state. So this is a first step. And then the follow-up in Missouri and Arizona needs to be start repealing the state level laws, because then you immediately get a twofer. Every time you repeal a state law, it automatically creates a ban on participating in enforcement of any particular current or future federal gun control that might be the same. So on guns, it's very straightforward. They have 5,100 employees for the entire country, 3,500 do enforcement. They can't close more than 10,000 cases per year without expanding the agency. They keep trying to do it, and they can barely do it. So what we need is A, to stop helping them do this shit, and then B, we need people to start exercising their rights without first getting permission from state or federal government too. Helpful? Kick ass. I believe this lady had her hand up. Okay. You're last. Okay. Well, the way I talk, he might be last.
Yeah, who knows? Anyway, my understanding, the Constitution as originally written was to only apply to the national government, and then until the 14th Amendment, it was an umbrella clause or whatever they called it. So I'm wondering, to the extent that the 14th Amendment does restrict things like, does make the Constitution apply to the states, to what degree are we libertarians supposed to sort of support these using to actually increase our rights among the states, if that makes question? Does that
14th Amendment, very briefly, because this is about a 2-hour lecture you just asked me to give. Seriously. Corporation is no joke. 14th Amendment was kind of basically going to federalize the Civil Rights Act of 1866. In 1925, the Supreme Court, on their own whim, decided to start saying the Bill of Rights applies to the states. And what that does is it centralizes decisions over liberty. The founding generation looked at centralized power as the greatest threat to liberty. Let's look at Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry specifically warned that consolidation, centralization of power, will end, not might, will end in the destruction of liberty. So we can use the old Harry Browne adage if we're talking libertarianism. Harry Browne is the guy who got me thinking about this stuff back in, early 2000s, late 90s, something like that. He's one of the only people that I hadn't met that when he passed away, I cried. He had that much of an impact on me. But Harry Browne would repeatedly say, whatever power you give them to do good today, you've also given them the power in the future to do the opposite. So I think if you believe in liberty, you always reject centralized solutions, because eventually someone is going to use that power for something else. I mean, I'm a 10th Amendment guy. I'm citing Spooner. It's going to be all decentralized, always, all the time. Ma'am. Hi.
Now it is.
Nice.
So I guess I sort of have a question, but also I'm just going to lob this nice little softball at you. First, do you, as the 10th Amendment Center, work to create sample legislation for people to use? / what is the 10th Amendment Center? Would you like to tell us all about that?
Oh my God. Was that intentional?
No.
Are you doing this to be nice?
I've listened to you on a couple podcasts.
Oh.
So I would like to just
second
give you a
favorite
chance.
person here. Not first. You gotta. No. Okay. And was there more? Oh, okay. Do we create sample legislation? Yes. If you heard about a proposal to turn off water to the NSA in Utah, that was me. We actually got a version of it passed in California. Yes, really. It was signed by Jerry Brown. The reason it got signed is they watered it down because somehow it got out. And I did this on purpose. I thought I was going to sneak it in because it was kind of a political thing at the time. But I made it so broad that if it had passed as it was originally written, they would have had to turn off all electricity and water to every FBI and DEA office in the state. It didn't work out like that. But we actually did get a version like that passed into law in Michigan. We created model legislation. The Missouri, they've modified it. Dave Rowland is a great legal mind in Missouri, took some of our original crappy versions of the Second Amendment Preservation Act and made it much better. We actually just advised some legislators in Arizona how to modify and improve their pro-Second Amendment legislation. We do the same thing on civil asset forfeiture, on ending federal militarization of local police, because they're basically taking weapons of war. They tell you they're old and used, but they're really providing new military gear to local police. And then with that cash and with that loot, they basically turn local police into a federal police force because they're working on federal priorities all the time. So we do it on all kinds of stuff. 10th Amendment Center is just, I don't know, it's awesome. 10thamendmentcenter.com. We have about 15,000 articles published. We just had our 15-year anniversary. I started it in my apartment with no pants on. Absolutely. In 2006. And I started it with the idea of, you know what, this Bush administration is really disgusting. Like, I came to this movement from the hard Trotskyite left, for real. A short example of this is, I remember back, and this will give my age away, back in the 80s, there was an airline bailout. And my instinct was, well, if they're bailing out the airlines, shouldn't the government just own them? I thought that about everything. When I heard about Dennis Kucinich like wanting baseball stadiums to be owned by government more and more, I'm like, yeah, of course. They're spending all this money. I didn't even think that government might mismanage stuff. So I came from a hard left. Thank you, Harry Brown, for curing me of that wicked disease. But I'm also cured of the right disease in advance, so they're both bad. But my goal was just to reach a few people, a handful of people with the idea, and I just started a blog, like, okay, everything that this Bush administration says they're going to do is they either lie about what they're going to do, they're not following the Constitution, and they are awful. And it's kind of picked up from there. So thank you for asking. That was really nice. 10thamendmentcenter.com, coupon code. No, I'm not going to keep doing that. I got to edit. Who's going to Tom's 2000 event in a couple of weeks? Okay, cool. That should be really fun. Anyways, do we have more questions? Do we have one more? 2 minutes. Should I do a little tap dance? Yeah, no. Hey, I got to live with Gavin. He doesn't even call me back anymore. Back in the day, I used to have this shtick as I go. This will close it out real nice. I've never voted. I don't think I ever will. I might. I'm not one of those anti-voting people who say if you're voting, you're empowering the state. No. I love Dave as a person. Dave was my roommate on the first Contra cruise, second. So I love the man. If I would possibly vote, but I'm definitely a pretty hard non-voter. I tried to vote for Ron Paul in 2008. I got a letter from the California Secretary of State the following summer that said, you're not on our rolls, even though I had the tracking number that showed my registration was in. So I tried, but failed to vote. Any conspiracy theorists out there might enjoy that. But so I had the shtick where I would say, I'd never written a letter to anyone in Congress, so I wanted to try. And I actually wrote out a letter that I planned to send, and I never did. And it went like this. Dear Nancy, go to hell. Peace, LPMC. Thank you so much for having me. This is awesome.